Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society, the economy, real estate, medicine, technology, and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plout. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, a 501c3 national American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva and Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission with a donation of any amount. Join our community of friends. Donate and visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center online, AFRMC.org. Visit us via our website and social media on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and on our Facebook page and discussion group. Our host and moderator for Global Connections is Robert Siegel, former host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio for 31 years. Over the course of an hour each month, Global Connections features guests who Robert Siegel interviews as they explore together important issues in our world. Today's Global Connection topic is New York Bounces Back. Thank you to our very special guests, Scott Rechler, CEO and Chairman, RXR Realty, Kathryn Wylde, President of the Partnership for New York City, Ben Brantley, former Chief Theater Critic of the New York Times, and Sheena Wright, President and CEO of the United Way of New York City. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
One of the lessons learned since our encounter with the novel virus a year and a half ago or so was that the experience of COVID among its survivors varies greatly. For millions of Americans, myself included, it was a brief and not very severe illness. For others, who are called long haulers, symptoms persist for months, possibly even longer than that. In a way, the question we're posing in this month's Global Connections panel on navigating the new abnormal is, what kind of case did New York City contract? In the spring of 2020, New York and its suburbs took the brunt of the pandemic when doctors and public health officials still had a lot to learn about the disease. Now, the city has largely recovered from the virus, but the economic symptoms of the pandemic persist. Unemployment in New York City is about 11%, roughly twice what it is for the rest of the country. Will New York City bounce back soon, or will it suffer the after effects of the COVID pandemic for years to come? We have four very interesting guests to talk about those things. I'll interview each panelist, and then we'll open up to questions. And you can submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Our first guest is Kathryn Wylde, who speaks for many of New York City's biggest businesses as president and CEO of the Partnership for New York City. That's a nonprofit that advocates for the city. Its members include some 250 of the city's biggest businesses. Kathy Wylde, thanks for joining us. It's good to see you. I mentioned the unemployment rate as a metric of where New York City is. For your members, what are the key metrics of New York City's recovery, and what do those metrics tell us so far?
Well, I think the jobs is the right place to start, because the impact of the COVID was serious. But on our macro economy, we really kept that going. We were only down in 2020 about 3.3% in terms of our city gross domestic product output. So much less than anybody thought. Our tax rolls have actually rebounded and held steady throughout the pandemic, thanks to the financial and professional services, the technology sector. They kept this economy going. They were able to, they surprised themselves how quickly they could transfer to remote operations and how successful that effort was. So that's the good news. The bad news is this had a disproportionate impact on low-wage workers, Black and brown communities in particular, workers and small businesses that did not have the capacity to go remote. They were either face-to-face kind of businesses like restaurants, or they were otherwise just not equipped to keep going. Many of our nonprofit institutions, and of course, cultural and other institutions that are involved in direct public interaction and could not function during the period of the shutdown. So starting in March 17th of 2020, our economy was shut down for 3 months, and that meant that our brick and mortar economy was shut down. And that had a big impact, and we measure that today. We lost at the peak of the pandemic, our unemployment rate was 20%. We had lost 1 million jobs. We're back to about 440,000 jobs that we're down right now. So we've begun rebuilding, but some of those jobs and many of those businesses are never going to reappear. And we don't really have that number yet because we have a moratorium on evictions until the 1st of September. So we can't tell how many people are going to be able to, and how many businesses are going to be able to rehire and pay back rent, and how many are going to go under. So that's kind of right now what we're looking at.
The Partnership for New York City took a survey to see, to estimate how many people will be back on the job working from the office come September. And the number was what, 62%?
That the estimate of employers of how many office workers will come back, and Manhattan had 1 million office workers in 2019. They're expecting that 62% will be back in the office by the end of September. And then it's a question of a phase-in of how many, whether they'll come back on a full-time basis or what they call a hybrid model, which means that we may face a situation where for some period of time, we will have fewer people, lower density in Manhattan. And that again is another impact on small business, revenues to our transportation system, et cetera. So it's a serious issue.
So I mean, is the cup 62% full or 38% empty in that case?
Well, it's unclear how many people were in the office every day in 2019, pre-pandemic, because we have, as you know, we have global industries where many of our workers are traveling on a regular basis, are in and out of the office. And so I think the impact of this is not going to be quite as dramatic as people fear, because we can't say that everybody was in the office every day of the week, ever. So I think that there's some exaggeration of the concerns, just as there are exaggerations about the concerns about public safety in the city. I think because people who haven't been here and just read the tabloids think, oh my God, what's happening? And in fact, we are a much safer city than we were in 1991. There's no comparison. We just don't want to go back there.
For members of the Partnership for New York City, I mean, what's the worst concern? What's the worst fear right now?
Well, up until yesterday, the worst fear was who was going to be elected mayor. But I think
I should say we're speaking the day after the Democratic, or the day after the primary in New York for the mayor.
Yeah, which constitutes the general election in New York, since we're 7-1 Democrat to Republican registration.
And New York kind of members, big business people, were not hoping for a progressive candidate to get elected mayor.
No, I think the biggest concerns are public safety broadly, to make sure that we don't, because the concern about the police and police accountability has impacted the city in a way that we're trying to figure out. And so there's a period of time where the relationships between community and police, and Sheena may talk more about this, but where it's a real front burner issue. And in the meantime, we've seen increases in shooting and in violent crime that have everybody very concerned.
But you mentioned a lot of low-wage workers, members of the Black and brown communities of New York City, who were hardest hit when it came to unemployment. Some of them are also undocumented.
About 504,000 is the estimate of undocumented residents living in New York.
Do those people go back to, say, all those restaurant jobs that used to exist in the city, or do a lot of those restaurant jobs simply disappear along with the restaurants?
Well, a number of those restaurant jobs have already disappeared. And so that's a big question. And the issue of how we're going to adequately prepare and retrain uh, unemployed workers for the jobs that require some additional expertise, some technology, familiarity with technology. You go into a restaurant today and that you're as liable to have a little card, QXR card, is that right? Where you see your menu as opposed to have a waiter hand it to you. So a lot of those jobs have disappeared or will disappear. And this was a problem before the COVID. We have a big skills gap. We've got 400,000 plus people unemployed, and we've got 300,000 plus job openings that we need to fill. And the difference is the credentials required to fill those jobs. And that's something that is a top priority for all of us to work on.
But what I'm hearing from you, just in summary, is a concern about being too doomsaying at this point, about being too negative. Things look, I hear you saying, New York can pull this one out.
Since we declared reopen, and I'm sure all the panelists will agree with me, since the Governor Cuomo declared that we were going to reopen on June 15th, we've seen a real resurgence in the city that, the masks come off and all of a sudden people feel more comfortable in the city and returning to a way of life where we're interacting with real people and not just Zooming.
Well, Kathy Wylde, it's although we are just Zooming, thanks, and stick with us for a little while. We'll
Sure.
come back to you during the question and answer session. Our next guest was on our first panel 1 year ago. In fact, Scott Rechler coined the phrase navigating the new abnormal, and we've been navigating it ever since. Mr. Rechler is CEO and chair of RXR Realty. RXR is one of the biggest property owners, managers, developers in New York City, with assets estimated at over $22 billion and more than 25 million square feet of commercial space. Scott Rechler has served as vice chair of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, on the board of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, and among many other things, he is also honorary chair of the American Friends of the Rabin Medical Center. Scott Rechler, welcome back. It's good to see you again.
Thanks, Robert. It's great to be back.
We've just heard a number of how many people, according to their survey, are expected back in the office come September, about 62%. You think that's low, I gather. You think that it'll be more than that?
From talking to all of the companies that are in our buildings right now, and again, we have Class A office buildings throughout New York. What we're hearing is between now and September, all of them are coming back. Now, to what degree they come back to, as Kathy made the point, is and they may not be back 100% of their people. There may be some portion that works remotely full time. There's some portion that's going to be in the office full time. And there's a large portion that people are anticipating at this point will be hybrid work, where they'll be in the office, 3 or 4 days a week, and they'll be either traveling or working remotely the remaining day of that week. So, but what I would say is that when I interviewed with you a year ago, I was in the office at that time, and so it was early, and we started with about 25% of our people, and then quickly that 25% grew to 50%, and then as people began to get comfortable and seeing the interaction, even when we were coexisting with COVID, more and more people wanted to come back because they didn't want to be left out. They wanted to be part of the conversations. They missed the mentorship, the comradeship. And so we quickly got to 90% and found ways to take more space to bring people back. And so I do think that when people actually come back to the workplace, get through some of the anxiety they feel from coming back and some of the complacency of not being in the workplace, they're going to be surprised at how quickly everyone starts to come back again, of wanting to re-engage, be part of a team, and again, fear of not being able to have their career and themselves continue to grow.
But as of now, RXR's business tenants are the occupancy rate is way below what RXR's occupancy rate is, as you've just described it. It's a lot more than it was a year ago when we spoke. But what do you have about? I think you told me about 18% right now of your offices actually being or the jobs, people coming to their jobs. Can that dynamic be so powerful between now and September in the summer that we go from a number like that, 18% occupancy, to effectively 100% occupancy?
And again, 100% of the tenants coming back, the company's coming back, whether they have all of their employees back differently. But I have, full confidence from my conversations with the heads of all of these companies that they're coming back. They're not, and again, just even, Kathy made the point that I agree with, there was probably, 2 milestones that helped accelerate that thinking. The first was when President Biden noted that any American that wants to be vaccinated will be able to be vaccinated by July 4th, which then gave companies the ability with definitively to know that they can comfortably reset an opening date and give their employees a timeline. And the second is when the governor relieved some of the COVID restrictions, when now people can come back into the office buildings freely. You can walk into our lobby. You don't need to wear a face mask. You're walking through your office that way. Even today, you go to the streets and the restaurants in Midtown at lunchtime. They're packed inside. They're packed outside. So there's a whole different level of vibrancy over the last few weeks in New York.
But if there's a significant amount of hybrid work coming and becoming part of the routine of life in New York City, then a ratio that you've cited would change, wouldn't it? You told me that, say, if there are 60,000 office workers in RXR properties, there are 300,000 service jobs that depend on those workers. If those workers are coming in every other day, do we think now in terms of only 150,000 service jobs being supported by those office workers?
Right. So, cities like New York are an ecosystem, right? So, and particularly in the central business district, where a lot of the small businesses and restaurants are supported by the people that work in those offices. Same with our transit system that's built for a certain level of ridership that relies on that ridership being there, and it's a fixed asset. So clearly, if we have less people coming back to the office and in that hybrid environment, it will have some impact. I also concur with what Kathy said. I don't think it's going to be a 1-for-1 ratio, because already historically people had been traveling and they're all not coming to the workplace at the same time. But I think we're going to have to make an assessment, and then we're going to have to sort of reset, appropriately for what the right number of people are in the city, particularly as, again, not only for small businesses and restaurants, but things like our transit systems that have certain capacity schedules that they keep.
I want you to talk a little bit more about restaurants. You said that restaurants are crowded. Are there also boarded up restaurants that aren't open at all at this point? And what can be done to keep more restaurants open?
Yeah, so, unfortunately, we lost our share of restaurants, but, the restaurants that were able to survive have found ways to, again, pivot and come out of this, in many cases, stronger than they went into it, because now they have the outdoor dining, so they've increased the number of seats. In many cases, they've changed their menus, so their inventory and their profit margins are better. They are having a hard time finding workers, as Kathy noted, and just even while they're out there today, that's been one of the challenges, at least right now, for restaurants. But New York's an entrepreneurial place, and when there's demand, people use that entrepreneurial spirit to fill that demand. We're opening a restaurant with Marcus Samuelson in one of our buildings in Chelsea. We're talking to other restaurateurs for our buildings right now, and I think you need to think about restaurants and small businesses as assets of the community. And so as we think about reopening and the reimagination for New York going forward in a post-pandemic world, is we need to have vibrancy of restaurants. So we're going to partner with them and support them and help them get open. And I think where the city can be helpful are trying to relieve some of the regulatory challenges that small businesses face. And then again, if they could even provide some loan programs and other ways that small business owners and restaurateurs can source the capital to help them reopen post-pandemic.
Scott, thanks. Hang around for the Q&A, which will begin in a little while. That's Scott Rechler of RXR Realty. Good to see you again. We're going to focus now on one a very important sector of the economy of New York City. It's hard to imagine New York City thriving with Broadway dark. Broadway brings theatergoers to New York City. It brings some of them to restaurants too, and some, I guess, to hotels. I would say just as important, it brings creative people to the city who contribute to the flavor of New York. How important is the theater to the health of the city? Well, we're going to ask Ben Brantley, who was chief theater critic for the New York Times from 1996 to 2017. And then for 3 more years, he continued as co-chief theater critic for the paper. Ben Brantley, good to see you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm just back from a trip to New York, as a matter of fact, and it seems brighter to me each time. But this is not based on any factual thing. As far as the theater goes, yes, as you say, it's not just part of the myth of New York, although it is that in a very potent aspect. It was what I grew up sort of marveling at from a distance, but it's a huge business. It was 1.8 billion in revenues in 2019, the last full year. It employs, I think, 100,000 people. And now you're in this moment where after this hiatus, everyone's starting from scratch, and the rules are really being written as to how audiences will feel, how you deal with it backstage. I mean, in these sort of different areas of interaction. But starting this weekend, Bruce Springsteen is returning to Broadway for a month, which may not be Broadway as we traditionally know it, but it's a very comforting show. He's sort of like the stage manager in our town, talking about his American life.
Why don't you talk a little bit about what the theater does for the morale of the city? And when we spoke once about the period right after 9/11, when you felt the theater was part of the city's recovery.
Yeah, well, theater, like much of New York, felt truly heroic then. They reopened 48 hours later, and shows that might have seemed like only amusing or interesting in another context took on this incredible emotional weight. I mean, people were sobbing at Mamma Mia. It just seemed like this great catharsis. An ABBA musical. There was an adaptation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Mary Zimmerman did at a smaller theater. That was, stories of loss and regeneration. And these things had been conceived of before 9/11, but they just seemed such a beautiful coda to it. And an uplifting one as well. And also people just being able to sit together and experience something in a common space, which I think is what we've been missing so desperately for a year.
The year of the pandemic was also the year of Charles Floyd's murder and the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement. When Broadway reopens, does it reopen woke?
I think there's sort of 2 imperatives that Broadway producers and creators have to think about now. The most obvious is they have to get back on their feet commercially and make money again. But there was, I think it's been a year of reckoning, the pandemic, on so many levels. And I think theater became aware, certainly with the Black Lives Matter movement, but the continuing impact of Me Too, the awareness of the inequities that the pandemic in this society, that the pandemic brought out. So I think you'll be seeing more socially aware plays among the first plays opening. As a matter of fact, I think all of the new plays opening this year are by Black playwrights, starting with the first play of the new season, Pass Over, which I'm especially looking forward to. It's a fine play by Antoinette Nwandu, and a sort of variation on Waiting for Godot. But interestingly, and this is not a spoiler because she's talked about it in her in interviews, the play ended bleakly as a tragedy the first time. In this version, she's changed it. She said her mother told her that New York doesn't need that kind of reiteration of tragedy at this point. So it's more upbeat.
By the way, do you think that the allure of theater, and you just described how good it was after 9/11 to sit together with other people. Do you think that the allure of theater is essentially different and more powerful than the allure of the movie house
Oh, no question.
at a time when we all have HD, high
Right.
def TVs the size of small billboards?
Oh, no, it's essential. I mean, and especially with live theater, as opposed to, seeing things even on a large screen with a lot of other people, because there's that exchange of energy between the performers on the stage and you, the audience. And every actor will tell you that every night is different because the audience is different. So it's a singular event. And I think there's a sense that we're all involved and that it's personal for all of us and that we're all contributing. And that to me is a kind of paradise.
Is there any sense out there that theater owners or producers, in order to jumpstart Broadway's recovery, might think about, say, discounting ticket prices?
Well, wouldn't you think so? I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that so far. I think they might be a little less, but the average ticket price for 2019 was $135. And so that includes the balcony, as all the way to the premium seats. But it's not cheap now. And I think in terms of addressing the social inequities that we're supposed to be thinking about now, the ideal would be to have theater that would be more accessible to people of different income brackets, where it wouldn't have to be something you'd have to mortgage your house for.
Yeah, think of that.
But do I see evidence of that happening? No.
Ben Brantley, former New York Times theater critic, thanks, and stay with us because we'll be having some questions soon. We're going to turn now to our fourth and final panelist, batting cleanup. She, we unlike some of the subjects we've been talking about, theater, Wall Street, to commercial real estate, she's thinking about the other half, how the other half lives in New York. Sheena Wright is president and CEO of the United Way of New York City, which he describes as a backbone organization that works across the corporate, government, and nonprofit sectors. The United Way of New York City speaks of a two-part crisis: adults who can't make ends meet and children who are struggling to succeed in school. Sheena Wright, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I'd like to begin that two-part crisis. It didn't begin with COVID-19, obviously, but looking ahead, how much harder are the challenges facing, first, let's say, adults in New York City who are trying to make ends meet because of the experience of the past year?
Well, before COVID-19 hit, 40% of all households in the city of New York did not make enough money to make ends meet. We often hear the term poverty. It's a measure the federal government uses that's really outdated, and it really doesn't tell you much. And so we really try to understand exactly how much money do you need to pay for rent, food, childcare, just basic expenses. And before COVID-19, 40% of households didn't have that. And we also had an educational system that wasn't producing opportunities for young people to achieve career paths so that they can become self-sufficient. So you had this, generational challenge, poverty and lack of self-sufficiency. I think Kathy and Scott mentioned some of the statistics in terms of unemployment, but the overwhelming majority of people that were unemployed during COVID-19 were Black and Brown low-income people in the city of New York. And as Scott described, we'll have a different, coming back to the office, and you talked about the additional hundreds of thousands of people that support that effort. Those people, the return is going to be uneven. It's going to be disparate. And this is the community as well that overwhelmingly was impacted by the disease in terms of infection and death and the state of the disease that they found themselves in. So it's much more challenged state. And what we even see on the horizon as the eviction moratorium is lifted in September, we see hunger is going to be a major issue for years to come. So that community that was already challenged has been really deeply, deeply impacted, and that's going to continue.
I mean, barring the use of federal funds to avoid a crisis, how many people could be evicted in the coming months once the federal ban is lifted in New York City?
You know, a lot. You know, it could be, you know, certainly in the hundreds of thousands.
Right.
You know, the state did pass some legislation in the last budget focused on you know, kind of rent relief and with some focus on undocumented, because a lot of and Kathy gave the statistics on the number of undocumented workers in New York City. They were not eligible for a lot of the relief that came through the federal government. But even what the state passed could impact maybe 300,000 undocumented workers across the state, but there are 500,000 undocumented workers right here in New York City. So, you know, we have to be very creative, you know, in terms of what the corporate sector is doing, what the city's doing, what the state is doing, what the federal government is doing, and really be very intentional about making sure that we're targeting resources and investments to the people that already had inequitable opportunities before COVID-19 hit.
You told me not to think in terms of a rising tide raising all boats. That's the wrong way to look at aid to New York City right now. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is, if we look at kind of the broad numbers, unemployment is now, you know, much lower. But if we really drill down and say, well, what is the unemployment rate for Black males? Or what is the unemployment rate for undocumented workers? And we really work to solve those problems. But if we're just looking at the top line numbers and not really, it's almost like precision medicine, right? We've got to really be much more precise, because quite frankly, you know, the 20 or so neighborhoods in New York City that were challenged before COVID-19 had been challenged for like 40 years at least, right? And certainly my whole lifetime. And if we're not very intentional and precise about what we do coming out of this moment in history, we're going to have the same, you know, conditions sustained over time and worse.
Well, what might be an example of using money in an intentional and effective way, rather than these sort of fire hose approaches, which I think is what Washington has turned to at this point?
Well, I think, you know, we often kind of revert to everybody gets everything, right? In terms of, you know, just take an example in education. We've had a lot of initiatives that were middle school for all, or whatever for all. And we need to really be there. I mean, we know what the zip codes are. We know the neighborhoods and communities that have been most impacted. We have to make sure as a priority that there's investments there in terms of learning loss and access to educational opportunity and food, and making sure that those families don't go into homelessness. So it's got to be a really comprehensive, focused approach to make sure that if we're trying to do everything for everyone, a lot of people are going to be left out, left behind, and really impaired.
New York City schools conducted a massive pedagogical experiment over the past year in online remote learning for the population of kids who were struggling before COVID came. How would you describe the results of what passed for a year of schooling?
Devastating. You know, the learning loss is staggering. You know, we knew before COVID-19 that over 60% of low-income families didn't even have books at home. And they didn't have books at home, not because they did not want their children to have books, but because they were really deciding whether or not they were going to pay the rent or buy food. And so being cut off from educational opportunity in the classroom, not being able to be connected through all the broadband failures, you know, certainly that we saw, and not even to have kind of the materials at home, the impact and also the social emotional challenges, really staggering. So again, with this huge influx of resources from the federal government and the state in education, it's how are we really being very intentional and precise about ensuring that families, communities, and children are getting what they need in order to progress and come out of a very difficult situation.
But what I'm hearing from you is there's a risk of a Great Depression in some zip codes of New York in the coming year or two, if indeed the right assistance isn't given, and it isn't even clear to me that there can be the right assistance.
Well, there is a date. I mean, but those neighborhoods and communities, those zip codes were already depressive. They were already, they weren't as challenged, right, as when I grew up, but they were challenged. And so yes, but I do think, and I hate to be the one who brings the whatever to the party, but I do have a lot of optimism that we can really do some moonshots just in terms of our approaches. We have to do things differently. We cannot take the approach of, these little discrete islands of success. We really have to mobilize cross-sector, corporate, government, nonprofit, working in a very intentional and strategic way to solve these problems. And I'm one of those New Yorkers. I think we can do anything. And so I think the will is there, the spirit is there, the energy is there. We need a very focused blueprint and roadmap and a level of accountability.
Well, Sheena Wright, thank you so much for talking with us. Sheena Wright, who's head of the United Way of New York City. And now let's bring back our other panelists, Kathy Wylde and Scott Rechler and Ben Brantley. And I have some pre-submitted questions. First, one to Scott Rechler. New York City has so many empty retail venues at the street level. What new uses do you foresee for these empty storefronts? And how quickly could that transformation take place?
Before I answer, I just want to say I agree with everything Sheena said, particularly in her last segue there. And I think, one way to think of it and ties to this question is maybe different than your depression concept, Robert, is that is on the surface, New York is going to see this roaring 20s V-shaped recovery. Yeah. But below the surface, there is a whole segment of our community that's not participating in it, where they've been dislocated from their jobs or had not had the opportunity for the training to get there. And it's critical that we don't lose the focus. And I use that word intentionality a lot because I think that's the word, not for the new abnormal, but for the new normal that we're in right now, is that we need to be intentional about how we try to address some of those challenges. And that is the same thing with our streetscapes and our retail, which is, you can't assume that just the normal retail or commercial operations are just going to open. And there's things, as an example, a program that we've been involved in Times Square is curating artists in vacant storefronts along Times Square so that they're concentrated areas and people can walk Times Square, and rather than seeing empty storefronts, they can go and view different artists that we've been working with Times Square Alliance and Tribeca Film on curating, as an example. The other is, again, as I mentioned earlier, as owners of real estate in New York, it's almost incumbent upon us to realize that our real estate's not what happens in the four walls. It's about the whole neighborhood around the four walls. And we have to be working with local businesses to help them come up, because that's the character and culture that makes our city great.
Let me ask Kathy Wylde about what you, Scott, had said earlier, your sense that a great recovery is coming after the dynamic of the summer. Kathy, can you share that optimism of Scott's a bit, that we're going to see all businesses coming back at different levels of strength by September?
I think we're going to see a period of strong recovery, the V-shaped recovery, but I think we are heading into, over the next 2 or 3 years, if we don't, we've been very fortunate that New York has gotten over $6 billion in direct aid to the city, and even more for education. And so we've gotten federal support, as have cities and states across the country, to help spur our way out of this. And as I said, because so many of our global industries have been able to function throughout the COVID at more profitable levels than ever, that's been positive. And to the extent, the other big issue we face is bringing back international tourism, because so many of our of both our retail, hotel, restaurants depend on that. Big question is how quickly that will come back, and that depends on the course of the COVID beyond New York. I mean, New York, our state has gone from being the highest rate state of the disease when the COVID started to being the lowest in the last couple of weeks. So we've had, but that doesn't bring back international tourism and travel. So that requires that everybody achieve that same objective. So we're waiting on that. Scott mentioned the vaccine, and I just wanted to say, given the audience and the support of this institution, Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, says in every meeting we have how grateful they are to Israel for the fact that they were able to accelerate clinical trials on the COVID vaccine, and how important Israel's ability to deliver quickly on the validation of the vaccine, particularly for young people, has been to our recovery. So I just wanted to throw that in there with thanks.
Okay. Here's a question for Ben Brantley. How will New York City cultural institutions approach resizing their budgets? And coming out of the pandemic, what kind of changes do you foresee in the nature of their programming?
Well, I think we talked a bit about, regarding the latter part of the question, about the sort of a more open-eyed social consciousness than there had been. There'd been so much interesting topical work actually in the years just before the shutdown. Slave Play on Broadway, Fairview by Jackie Sibler's Drury. I mean, which won the Pulitzer. These were major and provocative and really interesting works. So, but I think there'll be more of a focus on that, and I think there'll be an attempt to bring these shows to Broadway. In terms of budgets, I mean, people are making up the rules as they go along right now. Obviously, to remount a show, even if it, like Wicked, that's been running for many years before, but still is so elaborate, with a large cast, a large orchestra. I mean, there's got to be a certain amount of expenditure. I think if you start doing everything minimalist, I mean, I don't think people would go to see a minimalist Wicked.
I think I agree with that. Sheena Wright, how should the next mayor deal with the issues of homelessness and the increase in crime rates? What's the role of the community in addressing those two issues?
Well, those are big issues and many layered. I think certainly a key driver to homelessness and family homelessness is affordable housing. And, certainly Kathy has got a long legacy in that. And we need more of it. And how do we do it? And how do we make sure that it's affordable? It's really kind of aligned to what people are earning and making. There's obviously also a big challenge with homelessness that's caused by mental illness and poverty. And so supportive housing and really making a significant investment in supportive housing should be a top priority and is extremely important to combating those issues. And those are big issues. And again, I think we have to, again, approach it with this public-private, government, nonprofit approach. And then the other, as you said, is crime. I mean, the gun violence, all of it is really, as Kathy mentioned, really very, very challenging and concerning, levels at this point. And that really coordinated effort between community and police. There are 35,000 or so police officers at a city of 8, 9, 10 million, if you really count everybody, maybe city. You really need community to promote safety. And so I think some of the initiatives and efforts to really invest in community-based organizations that are credible and trusted in communities where there's high crime, as well as kind of low confidence and not good relationship with the police, is really important. And for communities to have the resources that they need to really bring about safety for themselves and their families is also going to be really important. So there are going to be new strategies. There has to be new strategies with bail reform. There were things that were starting to kind of percolate in terms of how do you really leverage community and law enforcement. But now we've got to turbocharge that.
But is the I mean, given that there are reports of more gun crime, Kathy says that they may be perhaps exaggerated. But is there trust right now in the community, in the police, that they can cooperate and that it'll be a respectful, helpful relationship? As was one reading of the mayoral primary is people are turning to the police right now. They think that's what the city needs.
Well, I think, the murder of George Floyd really, shook the trust that everybody had in law enforcement, Black, Latinx, white, whatever. I mean, that display and so many like it, has really challenged the relationship between the public and the police. Absolutely. And, people at the same time, right, who are experiencing, it's the same neighborhoods that are over policed that have the high crime rates. And so a relationship, it really happens, at the speed of trust. And also you've got to demonstrate that you're here to protect and serve my community. And as that happens more intentionally and there's more of a dialogue, I think that trust can grow. But law enforcement is necessary and important, but it has to be done responsibly and appropriately.
One thing that I haven't heard from any of you, and although Ben Brantley is talking to us from out of town, I will note, as New Yorkers see the world divided into being in the city and being out of town. No one is talking, Scott Rechler, perhaps you can address it, to the idea that the pandemic drove people out of the city, that it was a time to leave. It was a time to head off for the exurbs, maybe come into work far less often, but that suddenly people were fleeing the city. Is that still well, I don't know if it ever was as it represented as many people as I would think, but is that still the case? Do you still sense that, or is there generally a return to New York City? Scott, why don't you start first?
Yeah, there clearly was a period during the heat of the pandemic that people were leaving the city to areas where there was more outdoor space, less congestion, where for those people that had the ability to do that. And some people, may stay. A lot of people have returned, but I think the biggest stat that I would point to is the rental market, where people are returning and renting apartments in New York. And if you go back, even frankly, to the end of last year and the beginning, we've seen every month record levels of new leases being signed in New York City. There was a record of 9,000 leases, I think, in April being signed in New York City. So that may not be the same people, but it's the people that say, if you want to make it and you want to be where there's the most creative and there's the most energy and you want to be the best at your game and to have, diversity and arts and culture, New York City is a place. And so people are flocking back to New York. I think there was a little bit of a benefit that people thought that there was a price affordability opportunity, a window of opportunity to come in and come in at a lower rate for either renting or buying. But they're coming. And then, to me, that is probably, the biggest green shoot that I began to see early on, that New York City was going to recover. And beyond just the rentals, you had for sale luxury housing, which in New York is defined as $4 million or more. And we've had, record levels. I think we're on our 19th week of record levels of contracts signed over $4 million, the most since 2008.
Wow.
And so, so people are committed to New York.
But you're saying that window of perhaps there would be bargains now that people are talking about leaving the city. There was a brief crack. It sounds like hardly open for a second.
If on the rental side, I still think there's lower pricing on the for sale side, but on the rental side, it's definitely tightened more quickly. But and then going back to your retail question, that also has reset, which is going to be, again, some of these things, is not a bad thing, right? New York was becoming, the lack of affordability in New York, the congestion in our transit system, our streets. So some of the things coming out of this, of this crisis may, set New York for longer term vitality. The one thing I just want to go back to, Kathy raised a point that I want to reinforce, and it's an important point because it also ties a little bit to what Sheena said, which was, if we're going to be bold and try different things, then the funding that we've gotten from the federal government or some of the tax windfall that we've gotten as a city and other municipalities really needs to be spent responsibly and really needs to be focused and thoughtful, and not putting programs that, or hiring people that are, recurring costs when we have a finite window of that capital, and not having return on investment of training or loans to open small businesses, job training loans to open small businesses, those things. So we got to be really, I think, thoughtful and hold our elected officials accountable of not just, spending that money blindly for political gain versus a long-term investment in our city.
Just to clarify, you're saying it would be foolish to use money to fund jobs that have only 1 year's funding behind them, and have a quick fix, but one that's very limited.
Right. One example, but more importantly, be intentional in focusing where you're investing in areas that has an ongoing return for that investment. Ben
Brantley, do you still hear about people heading for the Hudson Valley or other parts
Well, I mean,
in the exurbs of New York?
I'm blushing slightly because I did live during the entire pandemic. I lived up here in Columbia County. I had been dividing my time before, and the idea was that it would be more balanced towards this. So when I got the phone call just as I was about to go into town to see a play that would have involved actually great physical intimacy on the part of the audience, I got a call saying no more live events are being covered by the New York Times. So I have stayed up here. I've since quit my job, but I have to say every time I've gone back to New York, including last week, it just seems to get brighter each time. It's and I love the communality of the eating on the street. It seems a less driven place, perhaps for the moment, but it also seems a much more livable place in a lot of ways.
And see how dark it is when you're outside New York?
It's true. I have to use candles.
I thought that was a room befitting a theater critic as well. I assume it's
the other point,
yes,
just
Kathy.
very quickly to what Scott was talking about on population. The other point is that historically, New York's population grows by foreign immigration. Mm-hmm. We're the first stop for people from around the world, talent from around the world that are coming to the United States. And it's always been a transient population, but that's what fuels our growth. And between Trump and the COVID, we've had no foreign immigration for the last 5 years to speak of. It's been cut way back. And that's the other piece that is necessary to reopen our economy and get things going, is we have to bring that back. And it's certainly a top priority in New York. And we hope the country can figure this out, both the path to citizenship for the undocumented who are here, but also to make sure that visa holders and talent and folks from around the world are able to more easily immigrate to the United States.
And Sheena Wright, your sense of either the pull of New York or the push away from New York?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think what everyone said, there's no place like New York. And, I think the tales of our death have been greatly exaggerated. It is a city where people do come and go kind of over generations. And the new people that are getting those rentals or buying those homes as people have left will still be such a draw kind of for years to come. And then there are those of us that are from here and that have never left and never plan to leave as well. Probably a small, unique group, but yeah, New York will continue to grow and thrive if we all work together to get it done.
One question that I have in particular for Kathy, I suppose, but also for Scott. I remember the financial crisis in New York City back in the 1970s, a high point of which was President Ford not coming to the aid of New York City, and a daily news headline writer taking liberties and summing that decision up as Ford to City drop dead, which probably did a lot to lead to Gerald Ford's defeat in the next election. That hasn't been the problem. I mean, there seems to be money flowing out of Washington in the case of this pandemic. Kathy, is it enough? I mean, if a year from now we're hearing from American cities, from New York, we need more. We need more. Is something wrong given the magnitude of the aid that Washington has approved?
Well, the subtext of what Scott was saying earlier, we're very concerned. We think that we've got enough money. It's how we invest it and whether we invest it to create a foundation for the post-pandemic economy. Things have changed, and whether it's in the education systems and whether it's in having adequate connectivity for everybody. And the concern is that, frankly, this proposed city budget, which is going to be adopted in the next 2 weeks, it takes that money and basically spends it on nice but not necessary things for the most case, and many things that should be done in our baseline budget that's funded by local taxes, while we dedicate the federal funds to the kind of investments in workforce and small business and other areas that are sort of building for the future. And that's the challenge that's going to face the new mayor who takes over next year. The projections are that we will be back in budget deficit of $4 billion a year in 2 years. So over the next 2 years. So we really have to, that's the concern we have right now, that we're not.
How much does it matter who the mayor is?
Well, in New York City has a very strong mayoral form of government. We've got a city council that weighs in on land use decisions, but the power to control the city and its spending really lies with the mayor. So it very much matters who the mayor is, absolutely. And it matters that the mayor calls on the expertise and the assets of all parts of the city. And the frustration we've had for the last 7.5 years has been the business community has felt that Mayor de Blasio didn't really call on the assets of the business community and for that matter, the nonprofit community either, to fully support the city and its growth and its complexity. And that continues to be the case, unfortunately.
And Scott Rechler, as Kathy Wylde, she was referring to you. Do we hear you right that yes, it's very important to use the money with intentionality, to use it for the right purposes? The problem isn't the amount of money that's coming to New York City?
I mean, just to put this in perspective, when Mayor de Blasio took office, the last budget that Mike Bloomberg passed was at $68 billion. This is the last budget that was put forward was over $98 billion. So imagine, 7.5 years ago when Mayor de Blasio was being put in office and said, I want to deal with inequality, I want to deal with homelessness. And someone said, we're going to increase your budget by 50% and give you $30 billion more. What we would imagine what the city would look like. And the reality is it doesn't look like that money was spent wisely. We still have a homelessness crisis. We still have, our affordable housing with NYCHA is still a mess. We still have, issues in terms of crime. So, I think that this is the key. And I think, Sheena also made the point a number of times, and I agree with it, and Kathy was echoing it, is we all need to be part of the solution. And when you come in and say it's a tale of two cities, and we're just going to forget about one part of the city and just try to solve the other, that's not going to be the answer. The answer's really got to be, we're a city that cares about the challenges we face, and we need to come together collectively, civic, non-for-profit, business, government, and work, hand in hand to try to solve this problem and build a more prosperous, sustainable, and equitable city.
Sheena, Wright, you hopeful about that taking place?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, we have a whole new government, mayors, borough presidents, city council. We have a fresh slate, and so we can, I think, get some more things done.
Well, I want to thank the four of you. If the four of you were running New York City, I'd feel really great, right? And feel much more confident. Thanks to Sheena Wright of United Way and Kathy Wylde of the Partnership for New York City, Scott Rechler of RXR, and to Ben Brantley, formerly of the New York Times. Also, many thanks to Joshua Plout, Nate Banzani, and Ronnie Giuliano of the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, and our technical director, Bobby Grandone. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization. It represents in the United States Israel's biggest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. The website of the medical center is of the Friends, is www.afrmc.org. Join us next month for Eating In and Eating Out, our changing relationship with food. Our guests will be Mark Bittman, a food author and journalist, Ruth Reichel, the six-time James Beard Award winner, Mark Fatzler and Monica Klausner, who are co-founders of Vistro. And then in August, we will reflect on how 9/11 changed us 20 years ago with Alice Greenwald, who's president and CEO of the National September 11th Memorial and Museum of History, Larry Silverstein, CEO of Silverstein Properties, and Evan Osnos, writer for The New Yorker. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Abnormal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.